firstly, do you agree that there is a sort of Judeo-Christian heritage that has informed the modern science? But also, how far do you go along John's line that an orderly science presupposes a sort of orderly mind at some level behind it?
Well, I think it has done in the past. Yes, first of all, I agree with John. I think that modern science owes we want to say we've got to be broad and we've got to bring in Buddhism and all of these, but the simple fact of the matter is modern science owes basically its being to Christianity. I mean, at least the science that we have. And I'm sure we'll talk about Darwinism, and I would say it owes its being to Anglican Christianity. Right, but certainly, I think that you're quite right to say that modern science owes its being to Christianity. Now, John and I were talking just before. We both you took courses with her, and I was very much influenced by a woman called Mary Hesse, who was a professor at Cambridge at philosophy. And she made a great deal of metaphor. And I've bought into this hook, line, and sinker, that I don't think that science is just, like Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. Science is interpretation. Mm-hmm. Science is the facts as you put them together and make sense of it. And I think the key is metaphor. Now, up until the scientific revolution, the key metaphor, that what linguists call the root metaphor, was that of an organism. The world was seen as organic. I mean, Plato in the Timaeus comes right out with that, but Aristotle too. I think there was a change of metaphor. I'm not saying anything that John Hedley Brooke and others wouldn't say. There was a change in metaphor to that of a machine. Now, of course, to a certain extent, it was fueled by the fact that we now had more and more sophisticated machines, and particularly clocks. I mean, this was the big one. So I think that more and more in the scientific revolution, the world was being looked at as a machine made by the divine engineer. And what happened was this became tremendously powerful by the end of the 16th and certainly into the 17th century. You read people like Robert Boyle and all of these others. They're using the machine metaphor all the time. The thing was, though, that more and more people found, as much as doing science was concerned, God wasn't very helpful. That, to use the language of today, you just had to get on with being a methodological naturalist and leave, as it were, metaphysical naturalism, the question of God or no God, out. And as one of the great historians of the scientific revolution said, eventually God became a retired engineer. When they started with the machine, of course, it was looked at in terms of this is good, who was the divine creator. But as I say, I think as the years went by, it wasn't because people were necessarily irreligious. Many of them, like Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle, were very religious. But they found increasingly, as scientists, it wasn't necessary, and it wasn't very helpful to bring God into the discussion. Descartes says this. Now, the fact is, they wanted to go on believing in God, but it started to make the way possible for what Richard Dawkins has called, you could be an intellectually justified atheist. They were not atheists in the 17th century, but it was the thin end of a very big wedge.
Do you agree with that assessment, John?
To a certain extent. I think we have to recognize as well that it depends what area of your science you're talking about. I'm a pure mathematician, and when I teach pure mathematics, I don't mention God at all. And if I was designing the rocket locomotive that George Stephenson designed, we don't mention God at all. God doesn't arise in the vast amount of the practicalities of science, even biology. Where the deeper questions come are, why can we do science at all? What is it about this universe that allows us to do science? And there I would begin to see the fingerprint of a divine mind. So that it's not so much in the mechanisms. Now, there are exceptions to that, because when you raise questions of origins, inevitably, if you look at the history of ideas, you'll see that the question of God comes up a great deal. And God as the one who creates the universe and sustains it. But you'll not find God at the bottom of the piston cylinder in an automobile engine. And of course you won't. And the danger is that because that kind of practical science was so successful in spinning off technology, people then began to take what I regard as a completely illegitimate step. And that is to do away with God altogether. And the main reason for that is the notion that science cannot answer every question. Scientism is rampant today, and I think it's dangerously false.
Just explain what scientism is.
Well, it's the idea that science is the only way to truth. And of course, as a statement, if I say science is the only way to truth, that's logically self-contradictory, because that statement is not a statement of science. So if it's true, it's false. Perhaps it's a bit too early in the evening for logic like that. But the point is this, that many people like Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking regard science as the only way to truth. Well, that would shut down your department of philosophy, and that would be absurd. And Cambridge Philosophy Department reacted very severely to Hawking's statement.
Before Michael comes back on this, I'd just be interested in you teasing a bit open the idea of why can we do science at all? That big question. Because as a mathematician, do you agree with, I think it was Eugene Wigner who said, the universe is written in the language of mathematics. He said he talked about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics.
Yes, that's a famous 1961 paper that all mathematicians love. But he was wrong, you see.
Oh, okay.
Because the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics assumes a naturalist philosophy. It is absolutely unreasonable that mathematics works if you assume an atheist or naturalistic philosophy. But if you believe there's a God whose mind is behind this universe and behind our minds, then the effectiveness of mathematics is something that I would expect. And of course, Newton, being the genius that he was, this was one of his evidences when he wrote Principia Mathematica. He wrote at the beginning of it, he hoped a thinking person would see that there was a deity from his descriptions of the universe. Kepler said similar things.